Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you all virtually here with us for what I'm sure will be a very interesting webinar with myself, Dr. Chris Price and Dr. Ian Horwood, as we talk about the upcoming US presidential election and whether Donald will indeed trump them all. I'm Jim Cooper, and I am an Associate Head of School of the Humanities at York St John University. I'm responsible for history, American studies and war studies, and I'm also a historian of the United States with a particular interest in the US presidency. I'm joined by Dr. Ian Horwood and Dr. Chris Price. Ian is a military historian of the United States with a particular interest in the 1960s, and Chris Price is an award-winning historian of Anglo-American relations with a particular interest in the 1930s and 1940s. Chris will be talking to you first about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Ian will then be talking about Lyndon Johnson, and I'll then be talking about Ronald Reagan, and then we will be taking Q&A from in the chat. So if you've got any questions, please feel free to type them into the chat and we will answer them as best as we can. So we'll each talk for about 5-10 minutes or so, maybe a little bit less, maybe a bit longer, and then we'll take your questions. So, okay, so I think first of all, over to Dr. Chris Price.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first presentation on this webinar. And I have a, just to make things a little more easy to follow, a PowerPoint presentation. What I'll be looking at is brief examination of the 1940 election campaign, where Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the incumbent, took on Wendell Willkie for the Republican Party. Now, this was an epoch-making election year, because, of course, it was then as now an election that took place at a time of great crisis. The Second World War was underway, and during this year, the Nazis attacked in Western Europe and conquered France, Belgium, Netherlands, and Denmark and Norway, so overran Western Europe. And so this rather changed the way that Americans viewed the world. So here we have a picture of the incumbent, the president, who was never photographed in his wheelchair. He was very careful about that. The times were different. And here he is with the King and Queen of the British Empire, or the Emperor of the British Empire and the Queen, and Eleanor Roosevelt as well. This is, as I've sort of implied, a carefully staged photo opportunity taken during the royal visit to the United States in 1939. The royal couple went to Canada in the first place, but then moved south of the border briefly to meet Roosevelt in his home at New York State. And became the first reigning British monarchs to visit the United States since the Revolution, effectively. So this was a symbolic effort symbolizing the unity of the democracies shortly before the outbreak of the Second World War. When the war broke out, of course, the United States declared itself neutral, but the president saw Hitler as a great threat to civilization and wished to drive his country more towards the Allied camp. But American public opinion at this time was more than 90% in favor of neutrality. And when war broke out, the Neutrality Acts were proclaimed, which formalized America's neutral status. So in 1940, the British were very keen that Roosevelt should win and continue his work of persuasion in the United States. And in a parallel to modern times, they were not above interfering in the election. There was a British organization based in the Rockefeller Center, which launched a sort of almost covert operation involving fake news and the planting of stories, wiretapping even, to influence American public opinion in Britain's favor. So tales of foreign influence on election campaigns are nothing new. And of course, the Germans were doing very much the same thing. So Roosevelt went into the 1940 election as the incumbent and effectively the favorite. What made this election so critical was that it seemed likely that his opponent would be Robert A. Taft of Ohio, a senator from Ohio, who was at this stage had history of being an isolationist, but at this point in history the isolationist movement had sort of mutated into an America First movement. Hardcore original isolationism had been pacifist in nature and driven by religious ideals as much as anything else, which stressed America's superiority as a nation that should set an example to the world in its pacifism, also tainted by a belief that the British had influenced America's entry into the First World War and that this shouldn't happen again. So Taft, you could say crudely on the isolationist end of the spectrum here, but by 1940, America First was a new ideology which had abandoned the pacifism of earlier isolationism and argued that America should be well armed because the world was clearly a more dangerous place, but well armed and neutral. So Taft was against any intervention on behalf of the British. On the right, we have a figure, Charles A. Lindbergh, famous aviator, who was a key figure in the America First Committee, certainly its most famous member, celebrity in his day, and spoke strongly against America becoming involved in the European war. So he was to some extent tainted by association with the Third Reich, and here we see the bottom picture. I've not put a name check for Hermann Goering because he'll be familiar to you all, presenting Lindbergh with a sort of an achievement award in aviation, which he accepted controversially around the time of the Kristallnacht in Germany, a pogrom against the Jewish population. Lindbergh was given to making statements that were interpreted as anti-Semitic, and it became relatively straightforward for the administration to tar America First with a Nazi brush. But nevertheless, they spoke for many people in the United States who feared involvement in a war. So it looked as if it was going to become a struggle between the interventionist Roosevelt and the America First stroke isolationist Taft from Ohio. But what made this election so remarkable is that there was a surprise on the Republican side. Wendell Willkie, Indiana businessman, came from nowhere, it seemed, to storm the Republican convention in June. And he was a committed interventionist who wanted all help short of war for Britain. The phrase all aid short of war was one that would become a watchword for interventionists. So Willkie appeared as if from nowhere to take the convention in 1940. And again, talking about the foreign intervention, there's a claim that the British organisation in the United States came up with a spurious opinion poll at the start of the convention, arguing that Willkie had more delegates in his pocket than anybody else, which gave him momentum. Whether this is true or not is up for debate, but certainly Willkie ran as Roosevelt's opponent, having won the Republican nomination. And this is what makes it such a pivotal event, because both candidates became interventionists who were looking to help the United Kingdom. After the collapse of France, American public opinion moved more towards helping Britain, because this event made the Nazis seem like a more formidable threat and a danger to the United States. Willkie's problem was that he had little to distance him or to attack the president with. He claimed he could run the New Deal more efficiently, but he wasn't going to get rid of the New Deal. Said it had been badly done, and he as a businessman would do it better. And also, he warned against Roosevelt having a third term. Roosevelt was standing for the third time, which by convention shouldn't happen. It wasn't part of the Constitution at this point, but the convention was that the president would only serve 2 terms. So Willkie was trying to convince the public that a third term for Roosevelt would be dictatorial. This is a classic campaign pin from the Republicans, which no third term. In the Roosevelt Library at Hyde Park, New York, the presidential library, there's a better one, the Republican pin, that says no King Franklin I, implying that he was going to seize power and become a monarch like George III. Unfortunately, this did not gain sufficient traction with the voters, and in the event, Roosevelt won quite comfortably in terms of American elections, as comfortable as they usually are. It wasn't an overwhelming swing in the popular vote. Roosevelt became one of the few presidents to win re-election with a smaller margin than on the previous occasion. but the victory represented the shift of the United States away from isolationism at this time, which became decisive. So, only a few million votes in it, 5-6 million votes in the result, but Roosevelt swept the Electoral College. This is just to kind of round off. It's an electoral map of the votes by county in the United States, and it demonstrates the extent to which the United States was at this point a divided country. From our British perspective, we have to rewire and have red as the right-wing Republicans and blue as the relatively left-wing Democrats. And this shows that Roosevelt took urban areas particularly, and the east of the country, which was more in favour of interventionism. And the Wilkie, although not an isolationist, tended to take the isolationist agricultural heartlands of the Midwest, which was where it had been concentrated before. So it was a victory that represented largely the division of the country between isolationist and interventionist, broadly put, but also urban centres went for Roosevelt. No city over 400,000 went for Wilkie except Cincinnati, which was the Taft base. So it's slightly easier to kind of follow map, which shows the margin of victory, and also it highlights the fact that the election was between decided the Midwest versus the east of the country. So again, it was a crucially decisive election, after which Roosevelt was able to move further towards support for Britain, most notably with the Lend-Lease programme in March 1941, which put the British effectively on an American life support system by which all war supplies would be free to the United Kingdom, with a reckoning to take place after the war. So the Roosevelt victory in 1940 was critical to the future prosecution of the war. Okay, well, thank you very much for listening, and I'll take you back to Jim.
Thank you, Chris. That's fantastic. Really interesting. Because of the parallels as well, the foreign intervention in the wars as well, and the fake news with today. So over then to Dr. Ian Horwood, who'll be talking to us about LBJ, all the way of LBJ and Ian. So
okay. No slides from me due to a technical issue, so you'll have to look at me instead. The 1964 presidential election, fought between the incumbent Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson and the Republican candidate Barry Goldwater, was one of the most intensely ideological in recent American history. Both candidates put forward radical and diametrically opposed programs. Yet Goldwater would come to be widely apprehended as an extremist, while Johnson, by comparison, would be widely perceived as a moderate. In the mid-1960s, liberalism was on the ascendant in the United States. Until cut down by an assassin's bullet in October 1963, its standard bearer had been the Democratic President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy subscribed to the liberal consensus that economic growth was now a given, and that barring the occasional minor recession, the US economy would continue to expand as it had done since the Second World War. Although there is evidence of Kennedy moving further to the left in the final days of his presidency, the assumption of continued economic growth presented him with a reason not to embark on dramatic reform. If the United States and its citizens were to become ever richer, then rising economic votes would resolve most social issues without extensive intervention by the federal government. With the assassination of Kennedy, the nomination passed to Kennedy's vice president, Lyndon Johnson, and Johnson was a rather different quantity to Kennedy. For Johnson, the assumption of continued economic growth represented an opportunity, even an obligation, to use this windfall for dramatic reform. Johnson had revealed this vision to the American people under the heading The Great Society at an address at the University of Michigan on the 22nd of May 1964. Johnson's Great Society was not one single program, but a whole raft of programs. But a key pillar had been announced in his 1964 State of the Union address, when he had declared what he called an unconditional war on poverty in America. Johnson was responding to the fact outlined in Michael Harrington's popular book, The Other America, published in 1962, that in the United States, the richest country in the world by far at the time, perhaps as many as 25% of Americans were relatively poor. Johnson sought election in his own right in 1964, and the platform on which he ran was that of the Great Society. It included unfulfilled pledges from Kennedy's 1960 platform, and it went further to encompass a raft of reforms concerning the alleviation of poverty, extension of educational opportunity, and civil rights, along with many other initiatives. The reform program was extensive. Indeed, it was the most liberal in United States history. In the context of the time, it was truly radical, particularly the endorsement of the expansion of civil rights for Black Americans, to which end the Johnson administration had already passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Johnson's project was to be an expansion of the work of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, with which he had responded to the Great Depression in the 1930s, and in which Johnson had been a youthful and enthusiastic participant. While he was perhaps the most popular and successful president in American history, Roosevelt incurred the ire of the far right of American politics, not least for successfully standing for election 4 times in contravention of the constitutional precedent established by George Washington. The long period of Democratic dominance between 1933 and 1953 was galling for former isolationists and proponents of laissez-faire economics. Even when Americans finally elected the Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952, he proved a disappointment to this constituency. He failed to roll back the New Deal welfare state and even made some modest extensions to Social Security. He also continued extensive federal involvement in the national infrastructure, of which the Interstate Highway Program was perhaps the most spectacular example. Goldwater represented this discontent on the far right of the Republican Party and departed from Eisenhower's centrist policies. Goldwater codified his perspectives on politics, economics, and society in The Conscience of a Conservative, a book he published in 1960. In retrospect, this might be said to have constituted a blueprint for modern conservatism. Among its key elements were the view that the expansion of a welfare state undermined individual freedoms, opposition to a handout culture, the promotion of lower taxes, advocacy of voluntary social security, opposition to liberal permissiveness, defense of the role of family and church, and a defense of states' rights. Back in November 1961, Goldwater argued that Republicans were, quote, not going to get the Negro vote as a bloc in 1964 and 1968, so we ought to go hunting where the ducks are. In 1964, this meant adopting a Southern strategy which would capitalize on the white backlash in the South against the Democratic Party's stance on civil rights. Southern white voters, Goldwater believed, could now be enticed away from their traditional support for the Democratic Party. This meant an effort to recruit middle-class Southerners and those in the southern cities by a sustained criticism of welfare, unions, and a strident anti-communism. Goldwater seems to have personally approved of black civil rights, but his libertarianism would not permit him to approve of federally guaranteed black civil rights, which he saw as a matter of the heart, not legislation, and a contravention of states' rights. And he was not above utilizing the potential of racism to further his campaign. As the journalist Richard Revere noted, the Goldwater movement in the South was, quote, a racist movement and very little else. Goldwater seemed fully aware of this and not visibly distressed by it. While he personally made no direct appeals to racism, his audience in the Sunbelt South understood his references to law and order as a code for racism, a manner in which President Trump now uses the term. The Goldwater camp calculated that if the Republicans could retain those states won by Richard Nixon in 1960, plus most of the South, that would be sufficient to win the election. Johnson hoped that his own position would produce votes from Democrats, but also from Eisenhower Republicans. And he reasoned that in the context of the mid-1960s, Support for the expansion of black civil rights was likely to draw more Republicans across to the Democratic camp than an appeal to individual rights was likely to secure support for the Republican candidate. The election campaign was characterized by extensive negative campaigning on both sides, but Johnson's vision was at least positive, while Goldwater's campaign was almost exclusively negative and rooted in the right's collective bitterness built up over the last 20 years of Democrat and centrist Republican administrations. As I've already suggested, Johnson's platform was radical for the time, which against any other Republican candidate might have been problematic. But Goldwater seemed so palpably extreme by contrast that Johnson was able to present himself as the moderate and respectable candidate. Goldwater contributed to his own extreme image by declaring that he was, in fact, extreme, with the campaign slogan, quote, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." And in truth, his campaign was extremist in terms of race and particularly foreign policy. In 1962, Goldwater had published an equivalent volume to The Conscience of a Conservative, outlining his views on foreign policy, called Why Not Victory? And again, these are the views he expounded during the election campaign. He demanded an end to negotiations with the Soviet Union and an abandonment of the foreign policy of containment in favor of an effort to roll back communist regimes. Shortly before the election, Johnson had responded to the so-called Gulf of Tonkin incident with a congressional resolution permitting him to employ whatever measures he felt necessary to ensure the continued independence of a non-communist South Vietnam. Goldwater insisted the president go further and actually declare war on North Vietnam. And in an unguarded moment, he suggested that the USA might use nuclear weapons to defoliate the jungles of Vietnam. Johnson's team found it easy to lampoon Goldwater as a dangerous hawk who, if elected, might easily get the US into a nuclear war. Better to vote for Johnson, who seemed the more reasonable and moderate on foreign policy. Ultimately, Johnson won the biggest landslide in US electoral history up to that point. He won 61% of the popular vote, 486 to 52 of the electoral votes, and he won 44 of the 50 states. Johnson, a white Southerner, won 90% of the black vote. The decisiveness of Johnson's victory in 1964 seemed to establish liberalism as the norm for the foreseeable future and seemed to mark the absolute rejection of far-right conservatism. The striking thing about this is that liberalism's triumph was so short-lived. In practical terms, liberalism's ascendancy would not outlast Johnson's single full term. Republicans would win 5 of the next 6 presidential elections, and Goldwater's campaign set in train a process which would see virtually all of his platform realized with the election of Ronald Reagan some 14 years later, and the establishment of the Reagan-Goldwater platform as the new norm of American politics. From that point, Johnson's consensus liberalism was dead, and American politicians of whatever stripe, Republican or Democrat, would be arguing for their own versions of the same conservative or neoliberal model. Johnson's effort to promote the cause of civil rights through the offices of the federal government, the apparent failure of the Great Society, and the domestic tumult of the 1960s resulted in a remarkable redefinition of liberalism. As Nancy Beck Young puts it, Americans became convinced, quote, that liberals no longer primarily work to secure expanded and individual liberties, but instead for entitlements through social engineering and ever more heightened federal power over individual lives. The Democratic Party, as presided over by Lyndon Johnson, came to be seen as primarily a vehicle for the advancement of minority groups at the expense of the wider society, and liberalism became the pejorative term it largely remains today. While Goldwater was swept from the board in the Electoral College and lost the popular vote by a very considerable margin, he had won 27 million votes, which was 38.5% of the popular vote in 1964. and his campaign offered the prospect of a fundamental political realignment, a choice between liberalism and conservatism rather than Democrat and Republican. The Goldwater campaign had revealed cracks in the solid Democratic South. Goldwater won 507 counties in the South, 233 of which had never voted Republican in the past. Although not an ideological conservative himself, Richard Nixon took his cue from Goldwater and turned to the right. By 1968, conservatives would dominate the Republican Party. Nixon would successfully adopt an electoral strategy derived from Goldwater's relative success in the South and win the 1968 election for the Republican. Goldwater, like Trump, was a divisive candidate. He inspired a loyal and unshakable base, but as with Trump, those who decided not to vote for him saw him as an extremist, even a lunatic. The effect was to drive people who might otherwise vote for a Republican candidate to vote for Johnson despite their reservations, because by contrast, Johnson seemed the candidate of moderation. In 2016, Hillary Clinton was herself too divisive to fill the Johnson role, providing Trump with an opportunity that he would probably not have had against any other Democratic candidate. Back in 1968, the shine had come off the Johnson presidency, providing a chink of opportunity for Richard Nixon, establishing Goldwater's vision as the basis for a new republicanism. In 2020, the roles are reversed. The most extreme candidate is the incumbent. Joe Biden is little more than a cipher, and Trump's base remains intact. But on the basis of Trump's record in office, Hubert Humphrey's narrow failure to win the presidency for the Democrats in 1968 looks like a better model for Trump's fortunes this time around than Johnson's success in 1964. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. That's fantastic. Excuse me, absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. I was scribbling down all sorts of questions, so I might well exploit my chair's prerogative at some point. Well, on the topic of questions, I would encourage people to start putting them in the chat now. I'm sure everyone's minds are ticking over nicely with the papers we've had so far. So, on then to the issue of Ronald Reagan. I will just share my screen now, hopefully. Here we are. Is that now sharing now? I think it should be.
It is.
Yeah, good. Okay, so let me just go there. Quiet upwards. There we go. Slideshow from the beginning. Okay, so the case Ronald Reagan as an example of will Donald Trump the more? Well, in terms of presidential election, just a kind of a general comment to begin with is that in some ways all candidates to the presidency are populists. They all run against Washington. Certainly if you're not the incumbent, you're always running against Washington. You're going to, as Trump would say, drain the swamp. You're going to stand up for regular Americans around the country. And so in some ways they're always running against an elite, a political elite in Washington, D.C. And we saw that perhaps a few years ago where Trump ran for the nomination and won it for the Republican Party. And of course, Bernie Sanders missed out against Hillary Clinton in 2016 and missed out again this time around. And you could argue that Trump and Sanders were asking similar questions, albeit they came up with very, very different answers. But going back to the idea of populism in the United States, of course, you do have a populist party in the 1880s, 1890s, which is kind of an agrarian response, you could say, in the Midwest to the Gilded Age as part of the progressive movement. So populism has a broad history in the United States. But Trump, when he was running, when he first appeared in our lives as a candidate for the highest office in the United States, people did try to compare him to Ronald Reagan. I think it's very much the idea of him running as the citizen politician. Now, I would suggest that if we were going to compare Trump to Reagan, it'd be more comparing Trump from 2016 to the Reagan of 1966, when he ran for the governorship of California. And that was when Reagan was a genuine citizen politician, you could say, a citizen candidate for high office. where Reagan was running as a former actor, chair of the Screen Actors Guild, and so on. He was known, had the name recognition as being in films and on TV, and so on. And so Trump, of course, runs with this reputation as a businessman. Millions and millions of Americans saw him in charge every week in The Apprentice, and saw him as a strong leader, strong image of a successful guy in business. So that's kind of why I'd suggest that the comparison with Reagan could be. So it's not necessarily Reagan as president, Reagan was running for governor of California in the 1960s. In terms of comparing Reagan and Trump as president, Reagan enters the presidency. He wins the presidency in 1980, takes office in 1981. He's very much a guy with a plan. And the plan is very much to shrink government, lower taxes, and so on. And he stands up in his inaugural address and says that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. He's saying that government will not sort out America's economic woes. Jimmy Carter saw the rise of something called stagflation, slow economic growth, high inflation, massive queues for gas lines. So this sense of crisis was unfolding domestically in the United States, plus abroad, the Soviet Union were playing up again, invading Afghanistan and so on. And so because Reagan had been talking for 20 years or so about the very much kind of echoing Goldwater, of course, his big political coming out parties in 1964 when he endorses Goldwater, it's very much a sense that the time has come for Reagan, that Reagan's ideas now kind of now matter, that the country's caught up with Ronald Reagan, that maybe actually Reagan goals, that tradition of conservatism are right, and maybe we need to do things a bit differently. And of course, Reagan also wanted to make America great again. But that's where I'd suggest the comparison really kind of ends with President Reagan and President Trump, where, if you might recall, Trump's inaugural address was very different. There wasn't a clear message. And George W. Bush, of course, was seen to mouth, "What the F was that?" So I think there was, I think you can actually perhaps the comparison can be taken too far between Reagan and Trump. In fact, anything, I'd say that Reagan is somewhat, Trump, forgive me, in some ways a bit more like Richard Nixon, or perhaps a rubbish version of Richard Nixon, where he actually hasn't really got away with it as far as Nixon did. When Nixon took a few years to be fully found out. So just how Nixon's administration was plagued by scandal, Watergate, his paranoia, all those kind of things. Nixon also, of course, did some fairly positive things for the United States, established the EPA, the opening up with China and so on. Obviously, Vietnam was a serious black mark against Richard Nixon, how he handled it. But the point is that I think Trump is probably a bit more like Nixonian in his approach to politics. In terms of going back to Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, Ronald Reagan, during his first term, he comes in with a real plan. He's got a real solid team behind him in the White House. He has what's called the Troika of Edwin Meese, Jim Baker, Mike Deaver, who really know what they're doing. And thanks to that and the real proper, fantastic political operation working with the Congress, he gets his legislation through. Reagan gets tax cuts through. He gets some spending cuts through, increases the defense spending and so on. But despite all this, there's a Reagan recession in 1982-83, which leads to a bit of a kick-in for Reagan in the midterms. Towards the end, though, of his presidency, the economy picks up and it becomes morning again in America. But in July 1983, the Harris survey do an opinion poll for the Chicago Tribune, and their conclusion is that Ronald Reagan probably isn't going to get re-elected, or find it very difficult to get re-elected in November 1984. That things aren't really going his way. The economy at that point wasn't going his way. The Reagan victory over Carter, which had been by about 10 percentage points. Jimmy Carter, don't forget, actually conceded the election before polls had closed in California in November 1980. That there was a sense that the Reagan realignment politically hadn't really happened, and those so-called Reagan Democrats were returning home to the Democratic Party. So in 1983, there was a sense that maybe Reagan, if he did run again, would lose, or he might not even run again at all because of his age. There was a sense that maybe Reagan would be a one-term president. But then again, things can happen very quickly in politics. If you look again, just earlier this year, in terms of the sense of approval ratings for Donald Trump, back in January this year, before the pandemic really became quite apparent and the impact the pandemic took hold in the United States, the approval figures aren't that bad for Trump. In fact, anything actually, when we initially thought about doing this before the pandemic, it looked like Trump could actually win again. Perhaps the win was in Trump's favor before COVID really kind of impacted on the United States and the rest of the world. Look at these figures. Trump's approval ratings aren't that bad in terms of January when you're heading into an election year. So in some ways, Reagan then was actually perhaps in a slightly worse position in 1983 than Trump was at the beginning of 1984, you could argue. But the last time then we actually saw an election like we're seeing right now was in 1984 when Reagan decided to run for re-election. Reagan and George H.W. Bush as vice president, they seek a second term and they get the nomination for their party, and they're up against Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro. Ferraro was a history-making candidate for the vice presidency. She was the first woman to be nominated on the presidential ticket in the United States, and she was also only the second Italian American to be on the major party ticket as well. The first person, of course, was Al Smith, who lost very, very heavily to Herbert Hoover in 1928. And Mondale, of course, he was Jimmy Carter's vice president. So a bit like how Joe Biden was Barack Obama's vice president, Mondale is a former vice president. He's currently a private citizen. He's not holding high office when he's in this election. But Mondale very much represents a victory for the establishment in the Democratic Party. And the nomination for the Democrats that year goes all the way to the convention. And ultimately, it's the super delegates. Remember, it was the super delegates which kind of won the day for Hillary Clinton in 2016. It's the super delegates, as they're known. They won the day for Walter Mondale in 1984. And he overcomes a challenge from these new ideas, these new fresher faces, perhaps in the Democratic Party. He famously asks Gary Hart, where's the beef in a Democratic primary debate. And Mondale then is kind of like an establishment figure in the Democratic Party. He supports having a deal with the Soviet Union to have a nuclear freeze, so trying to freeze growth of nuclear weapons and armaments and so on. Is also backing the Equal Rights Amendment. Ferrara, she also comes under real attack. She's kind of popular amongst Democrats as a nominee for vice president, but towards independent voters and conservative voters, she gets increasingly less popular. Where her husband really it's very kind of misogynistic in many ways, where the critics go after her husband and unearth and make all these big claims about him being involved in organised crime, distributing pornography, breaking the law with political campaign donations, and so on. So 1984, of course, is a kind of a bit similar to this time around, except, of course, what is different is that Mondale was the vice president of a one-term president who, of course, left with a kick-in electorally, whilst Joe Biden, of course, is the vice president of a president who's actually won 2 terms and remains a popular figure, really, in the United States. So looking then at the pre-election opinion polls, so remember in 1983, some pollsters thought that Reagan could find a tough time trying to win again. Well, on the eve of the 1984 presidential election, there's a real sense that America is going in the right direction. But big majority of voters, so about 57% think it's going fairly around the right direction, very well nearly 20%. So majority of voters are happy with what Reagan is doing. If you look at the approval, a similar approval ratings really for Donald Trump, where quite clearly the majority of voters in the United States think that the US is heading on a wrong track. And it's kind of been that way up and down during Trump's presidency, but it's getting really, really, really wide, that gap between approve and disapprove in terms of right track and wrong track, just as you're coming into the elections, which is not good news for Donald Trump. So Reagan's campaign in 1984 is also the kind of campaign that Trump probably hoped he could have ran before COVID, where of course Trump would boast about the economy growing. Now, whether the economy growing is because of Trump or because of the legacy of Barack Obama, that's open to debate. I'm sure Obama and his supporters will take a lot of credit for the economy. Of course, the stock market was going big. Trump could point to his tax cuts and so on. That the economy was going quite well in the United States. So Trump was probably going to run a campaign similar to Reagan, the idea of America's back, he's keeping America great again, that kind of stuff. Just like Ronald Reagan said, he was mourning again in America. And what Reagan does, you see his campaign team have these really brilliant, clever ads. Do go on YouTube and watch them on a Sunday afternoon. It's a great way to pass the time. Some brilliant soundtrack to them too, where Ronald Reagan's campaign team is saying in 1984, it's morning again in America. America is prouder, stronger, better than they were 4 years ago. And this plays on Reagan's very famous comment in the 1980 presidential debate with Carter, when he asked the American people, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And they all resoundingly said, no, we're voting for you, Ronnie. But this time it's actually, no, we are better off than we were 4 years ago, according to the Reagan team. And these videos, his campaign ads show people getting married, people farming, putting flags in the air. It's all very lovely in small town America, as people vote in droves for Ronald Reagan. There's also a brilliant ad called Reaganomics versus Mondalenomics, where Reaganomics was initially like a word, like an insult, a bit like Obamacare, was seen as an insult for the Obama administration. Then they kind of owned it and took the name and ran with it. It's actually proud of the Affordable Care Act. It's a really good thing. So Reaganomics also is a similar thing where Reagan says, don't call it Reaganomics anymore, because the economic plan from his point of view was working. 1984, the American economy is growing, it's booming. Yes, there's a big deficit. That's a whole other discussion, whole other paper, but the economy is doing better. Perhaps it was 4 years ago. And he says quite clearly in the ad that the solution for all economic challenges for Reagan is you cut taxes, you cut spending, you create jobs and more economic growth. Well, for Walter Mondale, he'd go back to the classic establishment democratic way of raise taxes, and raise taxes for every economic problem. A big advantage, though, that Reagan has is that he has friends, especially on this side of the Atlantic with Margaret Thatcher. In the summer of 1984, there's a G7 summit, which Margaret Thatcher hosts in London. So this is all the gathering of the big industrialized nations. And what Thatcher does, she makes sure that in the statements, the communique they all agree on at the end of the summit, is she makes it quite clear that they're not going to attack Ronnie. They're not going to attack her friend Reagan about his economic record, named the deficit. There's lots of concern in Europe about the size of the US budgetary deficit, which is ballooning in the Reagan years, and the impact that had on interest rates in America and around the world. But Thatcher wanted to not harm her friend's re-election bid, made sure that they didn't really get into that in that particular summit or in the communique, so as not to embarrass Reagan at the summit and therefore giving bad headlines back at home. So Reagan has a good economic summit with his world leaders. Also in 1984 in June, it's a celebration of D-Day. It's 40 years since D-Day. So Reagan goes to Normandy, looking very presidential, standing world leaders, some great photo ops, some great footage for campaign ads. So it all looks good for Reagan. So he has a little help from his friends, from his allies. Trump, of course, as we know, doesn't really have any friends. They all laugh at him at summits. Also, the idea of mourning again in America, this gets used again, though, in 2016, where Hillary Clinton makes comment in her acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention, where she states that Trump has turned the Republican Party from being the party of mourning in America to midnight in America. And Marco Rubio, of course, who missed out that year to Donald Trump for the Republican nomination, he tried to borrow that theme in his campaign ads, except he showed Vancouver in the cities rather than an American city. So that's one of the reasons why he didn't get the nomination. So how does the election work out in 1984 and compared to today? In 1984, Reagan bounced back despite what they thought in 1983 and wins by a landslide. It's a huge endorsement for Ronald Reagan. Walter Mondale, he only basically wins his home state and the District of Columbia. Reagan wins every other state. This is a proper landslide. And it's looking like, according to the current opinion polls, that Biden is going to win a similar victory a very, very strong mandate from the American people, where according to 538, if the election was held 100 times, Trump would only win 13 of those times. On the eve of the election, Reagan, in terms of the opinion polls, he was 18 points clear of Walter Mondale. Ultimately, he wins kind of a similar result as well, and on the only poll that matters being, of course, election day. And currently, Biden is about 10 or 11 points clear of Donald Trump as we get 25 days out from the election. We should add that in American history, in terms of a swing to kind of reverse that only seems to have happened twice. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was only 1 point ahead of Jimmy Carter on the eve of the election, the opinion polls. He wins by 9 or 10 percentage points in the end. And when Truman beat Dewey, Truman was, I think, 5 points behind Dewey on the eve of that election, 1948, and goes on to win it by 4 or 5 points. So only twice have you seen the kind of swing against the opinion polls happen in terms of the actual count on results day. And here, just in terms of people thinking about 2016, 2020 today, Biden is doing better than Hillary Clinton at this stage as well. Of course, there's Reagan and Trump. There they are shaking hands. They did, of course, meet. Trump wanted to say it was morning again in America, just like Ronald Reagan did, but he can't. He can't claim he's made America great again. And of course, he doesn't have the advantages that Ronald Reagan had. He doesn't have the economic growth going into an election, despite what's happened before. For Reagan, it was a bad midterm because of the sluggish economy, but it picked up nicely in time for him as he approached 1984 for re-election. Reagan had a clear message throughout his presidency, especially going into the campaign. Trump doesn't. Reagan has support of allies abroad. Trump doesn't. Reagan has an organized White House with a serious team behind him. Trump doesn't. Reagan had a united Republican Party. Trump doesn't really. I mean, in some ways, it's Trump's party now. I'm sure if Trump loses, they'll all come out with their moaning and the bearing, their dirty laundry. And of course, crucially, Reagan was up against an opponent who was who's Walter Mondale, was the vice president to have failed, who some was viewed to be a failed president. Barack Obama is not viewed by Democrats or independents, and even some Republicans, as a failed president. And Joe Biden, of course, enjoys that legacy. But of course, there's always a caveat, beware. The year 2000, Bush versus Gore went to the Supreme Court, of course, famously, and of course on a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court awarded Florida and the election, of course, to George W. Bush over Al Gore, despite Gore winning the popular vote. And I think actually it turned out he did actually win Florida too. So the Supreme Court handed it to George W. Bush, and this was a Supreme Court very much influenced and made up of by appointees from Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. And of course, we've seen Trump now make his third nominee to the Supreme Court. So it could be a 6-3 court in favor of Trump. So it goes to the Supreme Court. It could well go to Trump's way. And also if it goes to Congress, it could go Trump's way as well. So there could be a sting in the tail yet. So I think that if I stop sharing, I should now be back, hopefully. Have I stopped sharing? Yeah, I'm back now. So I think what I'd say is if you've got some Q&A, please put your questions in the chat and we will do our best to answer them. So I've got a question here. Is Trump's almost bullying behavior the American press because of the more freedom of social media and the little power one person has over it? Or as the last election campaigns, a candidate that also used bullying behavior in the press before? So Chris and Ian, have we had any previous candidates bullying the press?
I can't think of anybody offhand. I mean, my suspicion is this is a completely new kind of phenomenon, but I might be wrong.
Well, didn't Kennedy kind of like have an influence over the press? So didn't he talk to like the New York Times and people try to make sure there's a very favourable interpretation of the Cuban Missile Crisis and so on? Didn't he do?
Yeah, but it's not bullying, is it? No. Yeah, I mean that's absolutely true. Obviously, Kennedy was a master of massaging his own image, and that image was conveyed through the media. So that's the press and television, etc. But I think that was a much more subtle kind of activity, and it's not the kind of they would never have used the term fake news. Didn't have to use the term fake news because they carried the press with them.
Thank you. And what about Chris? Can you think of any attempts to bully the press before? You're muted, Chris.
Things that presidents could get away with. So, for example, Kennedy's massive infidelity that journalists restrained themselves from addressing. So I don't know if you could call that bullying behaviour of the press, but there's a time when candidates could get away with a lot that the papers wouldn't cover.
But the media were complicit in that.
Yeah. So that was sort of a contract, really, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But I suppose
you didn't stray into that area. It's now fair game, but it wasn't then.
Yes, I suppose your accreditation might suffer if you did, but
Okay, well, I've got another question for Ian. Is your opinion, therefore, that Donald Trump was a natural continuation of Goldwater and the Republican Party rather than an out-of-the-blue populist that took the Republicans by surprise, which was suggested by those at the time of his election?
No, I'm not sure that Trump is a continuation of Goldwater. Reagan is a continuation of Goldwater, I think. Trump is an outlier. I mean, it strikes me that, and I kind of mentioned it in my piece, that with the election of Reagan, that pretty much establishes most of the things that Goldwater was campaigning for as part of Reagan's platform, and indeed as the norm for American politics going forward. But both parties basically argue about the same thing. Democrats and Republicans, but they're all neoliberals. Essentially, I think Trump is a bit different because there's no ideology there, and that's populism, isn't it? It's whatever works or whatever suits him personally, but there is no ideology or indeed there's not much logical thought behind it. It's just a set of impulses.
Because I think it's quite interesting during your paper, and I wrote down a similar question actually about the idea that some of these presidential campaigns have legacies go on beyond themselves. So Goldwater influenced Reagan. Well, also, could you argue that perhaps Reagan and the 1990s campaign of like Newt Gingrich, the Contracts of America, and so on, that does in turn perhaps lead into the Tea Party in the 2000s, and then does perhaps the Tea Party feed into Donald Trump in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it does, but I mean, the Tea Party, obviously, this is another example of the kind of libertarianism that Goldwater was talking about, and that's what you see in Reagan as well. But again, whatever you may make of the Tea Party, whatever your perspective, there was a consistent ideological position about this. I'm not sure that Trump could articulate a similar position. Actually, the connection between Reagan and Goldwater is even stronger than we've suggested, of course, because Reagan campaigned for Goldwater, and he delivered a really influential speech in the 1964 election campaign, just a week before the election, which actually it generated more cash than the Republicans could spend, apparently. But this is a speech called the Time for Choosing speech. It's shown on television. But the success of that speech encouraged Reagan to seek office himself. And that's pretty much why he ran for governor of California in 1966.
It's a fantastic speech to watch it now. But he
wrote it himself.
Yeah, and of course it's one which he rehearsed for years, because he was a Democrat and becomes a Republican. He goes on that journey which he blames Democrats for, the idea they left him. but maybe he left them. Who knows? And he kind of would practice his speech going around the country when he was working for General Electric Theatre. But again, rather than me ask more questions should come into my mind, let's see what the guys on watching have got. We got another question saying, "I've never seen such divided nations as the US today. Neither have I seen such little evidence of effective governance. If Biden does succeed, do you anticipate the healing of wounds, or have we gone too far?" What do you reckon, Chris?
Well, I suppose echoing back to 1940, I suppose that part of the question, the USA was certainly divided in terms of whether or not to become more closely involved with the British war effort. I think opinion was moving more towards intervention, but it was a divide that was only kind of cured by the Japanese who were attacking Pearl Harbor. So at the end of 1941, the American and German navies were fighting in the Atlantic, but there was still no sign of a consensus in the United States in favor of joining the war. And even after Pearl Harbor, of course, it was still, well, okay, that's Japan, but what do we do about Germany? And then, of course, Hitler did everyone a favor by declaring war on the United States. So that was, so it has been divided before, but I'll go back to the question. Going down to it, Biden does succeed. No, I don't think so. I suspect the nation will remain as divided as it has been, because I think a unifying moment will probably need to be seismic in some way. COVID hasn't been, so I'm not sure what would be.
Well, I certainly think I don't think Trump's going away. Even if he loses, he'll be on Trump TV. Challenge, maybe if he doesn't lose by that much, he'll be challenged in the courts. So Trump's not going away. I think he'll be like Nigel Farage. I think he'll always be with us, one way or the other. So in terms of a divided nation, because America did have a civil war, so I think the United States probably, I'd suggest, is much more divided than the 1860s and 70s, perhaps it was today. But of course, that civil war, as we all know, had to come to an end, and ultimately, you could argue that African Americans were sacrificed at the altar of bringing that country back together again. So it'd be interesting to see if they do want to bring America back together again. Is it going to be a positive way to bring it back together again, like Chris, like see a seismic shift, or will perhaps be very negative to bring them back together? Who knows? Another question then to all of you: is Trump this new threat to democracy, or compared to the presidential candidates mentioned and not mentioned, is he just like any old candidate who rocks the boat? What do you reckon, Ian?
Well, again, I think he's very different to any previous president in the modern era. I think he is something of a threat to democracy in that he's not really very concerned with constitutional norms. But if you take the other presidents that we've talked about, all of the presidents that we've talked about, Kennedy, Johnson, campaigners like Goldwater, Reagan, etc., they all believed in the US Constitution. I think they were all Democrats with a small d. But Trump is not a natural Democrat. I'm not sure he actually understands what the word means. He's certainly not very familiar with the Constitution. So I think he's pretty different. He's not like the others at all. So he's right about that. He presents himself as a something different, not a traditional politician. That's absolutely correct. He doesn't play by any of the rules.
Of course, there's that allegation about Roosevelt that he was trying to turn himself into a monarch by standing again and again and again. He did it the fourth time, didn't he? But I don't think anybody really bought that as a notion that he would somehow dispense with the electoral process. Well,
that's the thing about the having a written constitution, isn't it? That people could say that was a contravention of constitutional precedent. But constitutional precedent's not quite as important as the written constitution.
It had been tried before, I think, hadn't it? But no one had got very far with it.
Yeah. So, Roosevelt was kind of justified, or he could present himself as being justified, but it never involved a fundamental contravention of democratic norms.
Is there an argument that actually behind all the twittering and all the chaos, that actually has been, in some ways, a boring Republican presidency? up until COVID, where he's nominated conservative judges to the Supreme Court. He slashed taxes to the benefit of business and corporations and higher earners and so on. One of the first things he did was to stop funding of abortions in Latin America or Africa, that kind of thing, like the money, American aid going towards abortions abroad. So in some ways, behind all the chaos and the Trump stuff, Trumpian things, he's just been a Republican president, which is why in some ways maybe the Republican Party have been happy to have this Faustian pact with him to get through what they want.
And he hasn't.
Or I'll be naive.
Yeah, he hasn't thrown his weight around very much militarily either.
Yeah.
No. I mean, that's the difference, isn't it? I mean, since the Second World War, Republican presidents have had pretty much they had consensus with the Democrats on foreign policy for the most part. Trump's a pretty dramatic departure from that.
And if anything, in terms of foreign policy, it's an argument actually that Joe Biden, like Hillary Clinton, could have been more hawkish.
Yeah.
And in terms of like Joe Biden's, obviously, we can probably expect that Susan Rice is going to be Secretary of State. Especially if the Democrats take the Senate, which is obviously, in terms of foreign policy, perhaps more interventionist. So I just wonder, is it behind all the bravado of Trump and the chaos, is the actual what he's done? In some ways, policy-wise, has been very Republican, but perhaps in terms of is it the norms, which is more damaging, the lack of respect for the Constitution, the behaviour, which is perhaps the criminality, all these things actually perhaps more damaging. In some ways, in the political stuff can be reversed, but it's the breakdown of the norms which probably sets more of a cultural problem for the United States going forward.
Well, I mean, it isn't. I mean, you make a good point in the sense that Trump presents himself as something different from previous politicians, but of course, actually, he is in many ways an establishment figure. He says he's not an establishment figure, but he's part of the country club set, and this is in many ways business friendly, an administration which is friendly to people with large amounts of wealth. And that's not so unusual, but I think the underpinnings are a bit different. Yeah,
it's sort of stuff that comes with it. It's very, very unusual. So another question then we've got is, given that the elections we've talked about today all took place against a backdrop of conflict and crisis, that's a good point. So World War II for Roosevelt, Cold War conflicts for LBJ and Reagan. Could we suggest that there's been a lack of external enemy to act as a unifying force of Democrats to use against Trump, seeing as the current president has seemingly befriended America's natural enemies? That's interesting. What do you reckon, chaps?
I mean, there might be something in that. I think an interesting point you made is that by the numbers, Biden should win the election. But those numbers really swing towards Biden post-COVID. So, I mean, my sense is maybe COVID is the enemy that the Democrats have been able to deploy pretty effectively. That they're, and it's easy to argue this, that Trump's made a pretty unsuccessful effort at combating the pandemic. Indeed, he's not made much effort to combat it at all. He's essentially pretended it's not there. So I think maybe that's the external enemy this time.
Yeah, I agree. Perhaps obviously Trump's he played it down, didn't he? Even though obviously the Woodward tape suggests that he shouldn't have played it down. He's trying to blame everyone else but him. And Biden, of course, has made great hay of wearing a mask.
Yeah,
just wearing a mask. What do you think, Chris?
I don't know really. I'm not sure what the effect of COVID will be, but I always have this sort of sneaky feeling that polling just simply isn't reaching the people who decide elections. I mean, it would be a major shock if any sort of vote went with the polling these days, wouldn't it? So this would be the first one for quite some time. I suspect, he might stagger on and kind of get, as you said, beware, take it to the court. He might get close enough to do that, and then we will be in, uncharted territory. So I'm not sure yet that COVID is that external force that turns people against the incumbent. I think it's because it's so novel. What people say about it to pollsters is that what they really think. I think it's probably up for grabs. So, will it be confounded and he loses heavily on election as and it's all gone as expected? Then we can be reassured that polling metrics mean something again. But until that point, I'm not sure. It's a point though that the external enemy. Because even in the Cold War, they had to have extra ones, because the Reagan administration tried to turn Libya into a threat, didn't it, to the existence of the United States? To come through with a population similar to Wales, and to convince people that Gaddafi was a sort of new Hitler or something, But I think it's one that the administration uses more effectively than the opposition, isn't it? Usually a unifying force. As you say, COVID might be it if the president has appeared weak in the face of an external enemy, and that's the disease. And then he'd probably go the same way as Carter, because I mean, that was Carter's nemesis, wasn't it? That he appeared to be weak against foreign threats. So I suppose the Carter election is the nearest parallel if it's going to work for the Democrats, and if COVID is going to be the enemy that Trump is weak against. But we'll still have to see, I think.
Well, certainly. Trump has kind of cultivated China as a foreign enemy to rage against to make political capital out of, and of course North Korea, which is a fairly pathetic foreign enemy, but to some extent was the only game in town for a while.
Yeah, he sort of blusters with Kim, don't they? I get the impression that they like each other.
Yeah, they're very similar.
There's a lot of big talk, then they agree on something. It's kind
of. Okay, so I think they've got two more questions in the chat, guys, and both kind of overlap a bit. So we've got one saying, maybe someone somewhat answered this, saying Trump doesn't win the presidency, what is his legacy? And linked to that, really, the question, do you think that Trump will have a legacy similar to Goldwater in molding the direction of the Republican Party, or will the party reject Trumpism in the event of a loss? So what was Trump's legacy? For himself, for the Republican Party? What do you think?
I suppose the news is he hasn't got one.
Does it depend on how much? Because if he wins, I remember in 2012 when Obama won, and there was I was in America at the time in Newsweek magazine, and the headline on the front was the Democrats Reagan. So out of winning a second term, you kind of shape perhaps the discourse of your country, the direction of your party, perhaps your rhetoric leads to policy developments in the future and so on. Whereas if Trump, of course, wins, maybe it really is Trump's party. That kind of the conversion's done, and perhaps you get like a Pence or a Nikki Haley in 2024 looking at the Republican nomination. But if he loses and loses quite badly, is that then a chance for the likes of Mitt Romney to say, come on guys, can we just go back to Republican classic now? Is it if it's a big defeat, is it a repudiation of Trumpism? But then do you end up with two parties? Because the Trump supporters, that hardcore base, they're not going anywhere. Trump's not going anywhere. So I'm just wondering, what do you think?
Well, I mean, if Trump is going, if he does lose the election, which seems likely, but everybody's very reluctant to call it after recent experiences. But if he does lose, he will certainly question the result. Even if he's, no intention of trying to overturn it, he'll question it. That'll leave a short-term legacy in the sense that there will be that base that you just mentioned. They'll still be there, and they'll be, aggravated by the fact that their champion lost the election. So that's going to hang around, that element in American politics. is going to be there. Exactly how long it will last, I'm not sure, because again, the big problem is that although it's an important kind of strand in the United States, it doesn't have. There's no coherence to it, and so I think it's kind of problematic. It's not like Goldwater's Conscience of a Conservative, which was whatever you make of it, whatever you think of libertarianism, was a logical package which could be explained. It's very difficult to explain Trumpism because there's not much to explain.
Isn't didn't it come from, you could argue that, excuse me, the idea, but I think you used to make the point that essentially in America, you don't really have a left-wing party by British European standards. You have corporate parties, you have two neo-liberal parties. You get basically got a right-wing party and a kind of a centrist right-of-centre party by our standards. And then you kind of got Bernie Sanders, haven't you, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez kind of like trying to change the Democrats from, back to some kind of progressive sense. But if so Trump kind of comes from, could you argue, the sense that for a lot of people, both parties failed them. That both parties for 20, 30 years talking about sharing the proceeds of growth, trickle down economics, opportunity, all this kind of stuff. And actually the scene that their parents' jobs disappeared, their jobs disappearing. That's kind of sense that actually we're just going to take a Molotov cocktail and throw it into the machine and watch the world burn. So in some ways, did we get Trump because both parties failed?
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's the one kind of logical thing about in Trump's 2016 campaign. He made that argument, that Washington doesn't work for you, and the fact is that since the 1960s, Washington hasn't worked for a large number of Americans. The trouble is, for that large number of Americans, although they may not be aware of it, neither has Trump.
Yeah, and I think in terms of legacy, I think you're right, and I think in the short term, it'd be whatever happens, will be a bumpy road. I think. Yeah. In terms of I think in terms of I think it's Trump's rhetoric could be dangerous in the longer term. In terms of what he kind of like bequeaths. A bit like what Goldwater bequeathed Reagan, what will Trump bequeath the American people as well. So in terms of Chris, did you have anything to add to that before we move on to our?
No, we can move on. I think this.
So I think it's probably our final question, and that's is there any similarity between Trump's handling of COVID and Reagan's handling of AIDS? So,
wow.
Yeah, I think. In some ways, obviously Reagan famously didn't use the word AIDS, did he, until 1987, and when it first appeared, wasn't even his press secretary dismissed it very rudely, and I can't forget the quote now. Didn't he say a comment like, "Oh, I haven't got it, have you got it?" And he's very, very kind of offensive and dismissive. But also looking at the documents that came out, from the State Department were writing to their embassies and the consulates all around the world about what we know. So I think at some level the government was taking it seriously, but Reagan, of course, didn't utter the word AIDS and didn't really get involved until later on into his term. I think in some ways, is it a bit like COVID and AIDS? Is it perhaps like the politics the Democrats trying to play? Is that Trump hasn't got a plan for this, has mishandled it? Perhaps it betrays a lack of compassion and a lack of empathy and so on. And just like how maybe a bit out of touch, where perhaps in the 1980s you have Ronald Reagan, who's a very old man. He grows up in the Great Depression, in the Midwest, and the idea of AIDS is just foreign to him. He just doesn't get it. So it's kind of out of touch. So maybe the Trump administration, but out of touch with, the potentials of COVID, the dangers of COVID and the impact it's had on ordinary Americans. Didn't Trump say that he's not going to do another stimulus bill until after the election? That's a madness. So it's about maybe how administration handle these things and what it says about them, maybe in terms of the politics of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think going back to an earlier question, possibly, the sort of the unifying thing that you need in this one. Somebody would. I guess if the economic damage of COVID is so great that it might be an occasion for a sort of New Deal moment if someone can plausibly offer that would be in some sense unifying. because it was a weird feature of Reagan, wasn't he? He spoke warmly of the New Deal because his family benefited from it, but it didn't seem to carry into his wider ideology. But I don't know. But so yeah, that would probably be the optimistic thing, you know, to get some. If the cure for COVID requires colossal government expenditure, you know, somebody could kind of appear as an FDR, and you know, and COVID could be an example of the way Trump's handled it. Could be a failure of the small government way of doing things that doesn't appear to be effective in a crisis. You know, rather like Katrina, I suppose, something like that. You know.
Yeah, I think that's right. Also, I've looked at one last question. Then, presidents like to look strong through illness, for fear of losing FDR, JFK. Is Trump's COVID diagnosis going to affect anything? What do you reckon? Is it going to have any impact?
Well, he obviously, it's his intention that it does have an impact, because he's obviously tried to present himself as a strong man, and it's kind of supported, although he doesn't say this openly. I mean, he's suggested, you know, that COVID is not much to worry about, and if you face it down, and then obviously he's suggesting to the electorate, well, look, I faced it down, and so I was right, and a strong man. But I don't. That's not changing his numbers in a positive way. So if that was a strategy designed to swing the election, that's not working. I think people who believed in his kind of line on COVID, his base remains intact. They think the same thing about it they always did, and I don't think this has made much difference. It's just reinforced their view of Trump, but not widened it.
Yeah.
I suppose after all, maybe he's immune now. So as he said, maybe that's the biggest outcome for him, for the Donald. Okay, so I suppose just to wrap up then, guys, I think you know it's coming. Who's going to win? This has been recorded, so someone's going to look pretty stupid a few weeks from now. Who's going to win? Chris?
Well, the brain says Biden, doesn't it? But I've got a sneaky feeling that Trump's going to pull it off rather like George Bush did in 2004. You know, that was against expectations, and was something of a shock. So, yeah, probably proved wrong, but I have a sneaking suspicion that he's going to get re-elected.
Yeah. Ian?
Yeah, I was worried. I've been worried all along that you were going to ask me that question. I went to an event in 2016 in Leeds, connected with the presidential election, and I said Trump would lose. So I don't have a very good record as far as this is concerned. I do think this time he almost certainly will lose.
Well, I think for me, going back to 2016, I was convinced that Marco Rubio would be the Republican nominee, and John Kasich would be his vice president. And a good friend of mine at Oxford Brookes, he said no, it's going to be Trump. And he texted me actually today because he said he could go on the record for this event. Tom Raab, Oxford Brookes, you know, he said that Biden's going to win this. So he called Trump last time. He thinks Biden's going to win handsomely this time around. I think it's going to be a lot closer. I think it's going to go to the courts.
Well, I mean, that's the suggestion I made in my piece, that actually I suspect that you'll end up with a result which is more like the Humphrey result in '68, where Humphrey just missed it. And my feeling is Trump is going to do much better than the numbers, but he's still going to lose.
Yeah. So and I think in some ways, actually, I think it suits Trump to lose, but not lose too heavily, because it helps his narrative, and he can keep his brand intact. He can blame everybody else because he can say all along it was rigged. Even when he won, it was rigged. So there we go. Okay, guys, I think we've come to the end of our time together. It's been a real pleasure, guys. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you to our audience for their brilliant questions. I've really enjoyed the discussion, and I think now we just need it to come to an end. Do we click leave?